Hey friends, tomorrow, Saturday, June 4th, is my birthday, and I'd love for you to join me for a birthday live stream. It starts at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll go to, question mark. I'll be reading your submitted stories live, and there may or may not be peanut butter whiskey involved. We'll see you tomorrow. Lindsay and I had been best friends as far back as I can remember. All through primary school, we'd always be in the same classes. She was family to me. Unfortunately, things began to change about the time high school started. I began to see her differently. I don't know why, but I suddenly became convinced that I loved her. And I don't mean the way that I always had. This was special. It's a very confusing time for boys regardless, but my newfound love for her left me disoriented and scared. It was new and uncharted territory. Without advice from an experienced older male, I had zero idea how to proceed or if I should at all. The answer came to me one evening while watching an old movie with my parents. The lead character was in a position similar to mine. He talked about something called a secret admirer. This is when a person sends letters or notes to someone that they're interested in but does so anonymously. This sounded perfect to me. I could tell Lindsay how I felt without her knowing it was me. Then I could hear how she really felt without the possibility of our friendship messing things up. Hopefully, she'd fall in love with her admirer and I could reveal myself. I sat down at my desk that night and poured out my heart to her, or at least her secret admirer did. To be safe, I snuck out early the next morning and rode my bike to the post office. I kissed the envelope for luck, said a short prayer, and dropped it into the box. It was all up to God now. The wait was agonizing. On day 4, Lindsay mentioned a surprise that she'd gotten in the post. I played it cool, but my heart was pounding like a jackhammer. The way she talked about the letter was somewhat unclear. She would smile while recalling some things while also calling it juvenile and foolish. It was not good looking, but I was far from discouraged. I couldn't have walked away if I wanted to. Lindsay became my world and I couldn't see any future without us together, and I continued with the plan. With each new letter, I could see her warming up to her secret crush, as she put it. Looking back, she wasn't the only one to change. I began to love the power I had over her. Hearing her speak about her admirer and knowing she had no clue it was me, it was an intoxicating feeling. I'm a bit disgusted about how I viewed things then, but it's part of the story, so I do have to include it. Before I knew it, a year had passed and we'd begun to drift apart. I kept up with the letters but gradually saw her less and less. Her popularity had increased and her friend group changed. I was the opposite of popular. She didn't ignore me in front of her new friends, but I got the impression that I'd slipped way down on her list of importance. I understood why everyone loved her. Maybe not like I did, but it made sense. As long as I had her to myself once in a while, I was happy. And then I heard news that she was seeing someone, and it felt like a knife in my gut. I wanted to be cool about it, but just under the surface, I was livid. I feared the little time we still had together would evaporate, and I proved to be right. Every time I called her to hang out, she'd be busy with him. I maintained a cool facade, but it was just that. I often cried myself to sleep. The truth was finally beginning to hit me. Her and I had no real hope of ever being in a real relationship. I'd friend-zoned myself without even realizing it. Even then, I didn't stop the letters completely. On the rare occasion I felt optimistic, I'd sit down and pour out my feelings on paper. More than once, I had to tear up the letter because I mentioned something that would give me away. I couldn't stop my anger from showing through. I was never mean to her, but I considered her boyfriend fair game, and this would be the mistake that unmasked me. I regret it to this day. In my last letter, I must have said something too revealing. I wouldn't be aware of this until I ran into Lindsay's boyfriend. He was busy at the moment, but wanted to speak to me privately. We made arrangements to do so a few hours later. We met at a park near my house. He was already there when I arrived. I assume he wanted to ask my opinion about a gift for Lindsay's upcoming birthday. I offered my hand as a greeting as I approached, and rather than shake it, he punched me solidly across the chin. I crumpled up like a piece of paper, and then he kicked me square in the nuts. I'm not sure how long I was unconscious, but when I did regain a semblance of clarity, I felt a cold object on my neck. It was a knife, a sharp one. All he had to do was apply the least amount of pressure and I'd be dead before I could count to 60. I realized I'd messed up bad. He proceeded to tell me that he knew that I was Lindsay's secret admirer and that he would kill me if I ever spoke to her again. As terrified as I was in that moment, my pride wanted me to say no. This would mean the end of all my dreams. Fortunately, I didn't listen. I reluctantly agreed and he put the knife away, giving me one more good kick in the side as he walked away. As anticlimactic as it sounds, that was the end. I'd had the fear beaten into me and I didn't want another helping. The guy was a well-known psycho around town, and from that day on, everything was over. I'm not sure if Lindsay actually knew what had occurred, but she treated me as a stranger for our remaining time in school. I wouldn't hold it against her either way. I crossed the line and deserved what I got. Seeing her only made things more painful, so I did my best to avoid any place that I thought she may be. Even after her and that particular boyfriend broke up, I kept my distance. The damage had been done. It's been 12 years since high school ended, yet I still think about her often. My recent divorce has put her in the forefront of my mind lately. Even if that door is closed forever, I hope whoever she's chosen to spend her life with, that she is loved as much as I loved her then. I want that more than anything, even if it isn't with me. I'm probably older than most people here. My story takes place way back in the 1990s. Most people hadn't even heard of the internet yet. Besides the telephone, handwritten letters were still the most common way for people to communicate. If you've had something to say and time wasn't important, you'd scrawl your thoughts out on a piece of paper and mail it off. For hundreds of years, humans would commit their most heartfelt feelings to paper and send them around the world. Receiving a letter from a loved one while separated could be a welcomed remedy for a homesick heart. This was especially true during times of war. A letter from a sweetheart or parent could lift a soldier's morale. So important, many were read over and over, often being read out loud to fellow soldiers in quiet times between engagements. It had its pros and cons, but I look back on it fondly. I make sure to keep any letter I receive now. The sender must have had something special to say by going to such trouble when faster options are plentiful. At 16, I was sent the first of many anonymous letters, a pattern that would continue for almost a year. Other than the gender of the sender, I knew nothing of their identity. Their purpose was much clearer, though. They wanted me to know how much they loved me, and it appeared that I had a secret admirer. Although I'm sure a lot of people would see that as stalker behavior today, I didn't. I was the focus of a girl's affections, and I loved it. Up until this point, I had zero luck with any girls. Not only was I an awkward introvert and overweight, my severe acne made me a bit of a pariah, as I once put it. With the arrival of the first letter, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Normal. Most guys in my position probably have tried to discover their admirer's name, and I preferred not to know. I only found out later by accident. The potential was the most exciting thing about it. It could have been anyone and everyone. I let my mind take over, and in this fantasy, the sender changed depending on my crush at that moment. Almost everyone I knew was a possibility at some point. Everyone except for who it actually turned out to be. If I remember right, the truth came out just after my 17th birthday. My main focus now was on where I was going to attend college. I would be the first member of our family to go, and my parents were naturally excited about this. I guess in all the fuss, my younger sister felt ignored. I'm sure there were other contributing factors, but they have been lost to time. Regardless, an argument ensued in which she let the name of my secret admirer slip. I've been bragging about my forthcoming scholarly prospects, and she'd had enough. Her words are the only thing from that time that I know I'll never forget. "You think you're so smart, but you haven't even figured out that Carla is the one who's been writing all those stupid letters." The revelation made me sick. Carla was my sister's best friend. I'd known her my entire life, and she was only 14. I wanted it to be a lie, but I knew that it wasn't. I never told anyone about the letters, and certainly never would have told Nicole, my sister. She had to have had inside information. Here's the part in the story where your writer made a big mistake. One I'd regret for a long time to come. I was furious once I'd learned my admirer's identity, and I called Carla to give her a piece of my mind. In retrospect, I was far harsher than I needed to be, but I felt so betrayed, not to mention stupid. When I hung up, she was bawling her eyes out. I didn't care. In my mind, she deserved every word. After that, I tried to start over. So much of my life had been wrapped up in the fantasy, and college was all I had left, and I focused all my energy into it. Had my sister and I been speaking at the time, I may have seen what was coming. One night before bed, I let my dog, Lucky, out to do his thing. I was in the kitchen making peanut butter and jelly when I heard a crack, followed by a yelp. Lucky ran inside. He was limping and blood was running down his back leg. I freaked out and yelled for my parents. They ran in and I showed them Lucky's injury. We were fortunate to have an emergency vet nearby. We called him and he told us to bring him in. When he told us that Lucky had been shot, likely with a .22, we were mortified. No one had any idea who would do such a thing, but it wouldn't be long before I found out. I was playing a Nintendo game when the phone rang. My mom yelled for me to answer it, which I did. An unfamiliar voice asked me by name, and I identified myself. The anonymous caller then asked how Lucky was doing. I said that he was doing well before I realized that no one outside of our family but the vet should have known about the shooting. I sheepishly inquired if I was speaking to the vet or someone who worked for him, but the caller said no. Then it hit me. This had to have been the shooter, and I was mad now. I started yelling and asked why he would do such a mean thing. The caller turned out to be Carla's brother, Clint. I never met the guy, but he certainly knew me. He claimed that his sister had been a basket case since my call. She wouldn't eat or leave her room and often cried herself to sleep. His demand was a simple one. If I didn't want my dog to die the next time, I would apologize to Carla in person. I didn't need any time to think. I didn't want Lucky to suffer any more than he already had. I was still livid with the guy, but I agreed and hung up. Although I briefly considered telling my parents, I decided to deal with it myself since I'd been the cause of all the trouble in the first place. Later that day, I walked over to Carla and Clint's house and apologized. Clint insisted on being present for it. I groveled and begged her to accept the apology, and she did. Once he was satisfied, Clint left us alone to continue our discussion. Her and I spoke for another half hour. We discussed the letters among other things. She hadn't actually ever expected us to get together. She just wanted to share her feelings without there being any weird stuff between us. I apologized again and promised her that we could be friends. We hugged and I went on my way. The following day, another call came from Clint. Just the sound of his voice made me sick to my stomach. And it wasn't bad news, though. He just wanted to thank me for the apology. Carla was back to her old self and started eating again. I was still a bit nervous and double-checked to make sure that things were okay. He promised it was. We'd speak a few more times after that, and he turned out to be an okay guy. Don't get me wrong, I still think the guy's a psycho, but I can almost understand why he did it. Even a crude a-hole like myself would do just about anything for my family. Life went into high speed after that. Before I knew it, I was starting college and the events of my prior year were all but forgotten. Lucky would make a full recovery and go on to live another 6 years, even playing a small but important part in my wedding. If you're wondering what happened to Carla, I'm sorry to say that I don't know. Her and my sister lost contact when they went off to school and haven't spoken since then, at least to my knowledge. Whatever she's doing now, I hope she found a guy her age and they're doing well. And for the sake of the guy's health, I hope he doesn't ever upset Carla the way I did. He'll certainly regret it, it seems, as I speak from first-hand experience. Just after April of last year, I began getting messages from a phone number I did not recognize. This was especially unnerving as I had only been in the area a brief time. Because of some problems I'll get into later, I had essentially been forced to flee from my hometown in the middle of the night. My number was a new one, and I could count those that I'd given it to on one hand. I thought I'd been careful. I deleted the first few without reading them, but soon thought the better of this. What I found left me very ambivalent. It appeared that I had picked up an anonymous crush somewhere along the way. I was flattered by the attention, but not knowing their identity was also scary. I was terrified that I'd been located and began planning another move. As I was just days away from leaving, a new message arrived that made me rethink my decision. It read, "Please don't be afraid. I mean you no harm. It is the exact opposite of that, in fact. You brighten every room in which you enter, and my world is all the better by you being in it. I don't know you well, but I sense you may have had a traumatic past. Please allow me to help you heal those old wounds. I may not yet have the courage to face you, but I dream of a time soon when I may come to you, and we can truly get to know one another and hopefully build a future together. For the sake of love, please give me a chance." After reading that, I was at a loss. I'd never had another human being express their feelings in quite such an honest way. The situation was odd, but a large part of me had been craving this type of attention my whole life. If you've never had a normal, healthy relationship like me, you'll understand how beautiful his words sounded. This was the first time in months that I'd allowed myself to relax and stop looking over my shoulder. It was uncharted territory for me, but I didn't think that I had anything to lose at that point. For the present, I'd stay where I was. My admirer and I traded occasional messages for about 2 or 3 months, and everything was going well. He grew more and more courageous until the day came that he suggested that we meet. Many questions had yet to be answered, and he promised that this would be the time. I knew the day would come and even looked forward to it sometimes, but that deep-seated fear of being discovered kept me reluctant. I had one female coworker I trusted, and we discussed it. Her opinion was that I couldn't hide myself away forever. If I thought this man was worth risking finding happiness, I should go for it. It sounded like a solid stance to me, so I let him know that I was ready. We came to an agreement, and I began preparing myself for the meeting later in the week. A strange thing happened on the day the date was scheduled. Just an hour prior, he sent a message claiming that his car had broken down. I suggested that he get an Uber to my place and we could go out to dinner in my car. Up until this point, no one but my employer knew where I lived. The fewer who knew, the better in my mind. When the message arrived, I stood and stared at the phone screen for a long time, unsure of how to proceed. Something about the message bothered me. It all seemed overly complicated and pointless. For a brief moment, I almost agreed, but at the last second I came up with a better suggestion. I said, "I got a better idea. How about you just take the Uber to the restaurant and I'll meet you there? If things go well, maybe I can give you a ride home after." Had he agreed to this, things may have gone differently, but he continued pressing. Now, some red flags were beginning to go up. "I'd really like to see you before we go out. Wouldn't you like to know if I'm a toad before wasting money on me? Come on, I'll be a good boy, I promise," he texted me. His pushiness made me uncomfortable and was unlike his prior behavior. My gut was telling me to cancel. I waited until a few minutes before I was to leave and sent a message saying that I couldn't make it. I felt like a real tease, but I wasn't willing to risk my safety after all I'd gone through. He tried to change my mind, but by now, I'd convinced myself. After he sent 2 more messages, I got fed up and turned off my phone. I figured that I could deal with the fallout in the morning. What awaited me the next morning was nothing short of terrifying. 22 more messages. Each one sounded more desperate than the prior. However, it was the last that made my blood run cold. You're smarter than I gave you credit for. You may have gotten away from me today, but it's only a matter of time before I catch up with you. I've already gotten your number. Your address is next. You can run, but I will find you. Then you're going to regret the day you left. Neil. This was the day that I've been dreading for over a year. Neil was my husband, you see. We'd been high school sweethearts who'd married right after graduation. Everything went okay until he was laid off and he began drinking heavily, and this quickly led to him abusing me mentally and physically. Things came to a head the night that he beat me so badly that I actually lost our child that I was carrying. It was incredible trauma, and he didn't seem to care. I knew right then that the man I'd fell in love with was gone. A heartless psychopath had taken his place, and I no longer had anything holding me there. The next night, I waited until he passed out and I made my escape. I took the little money I had and contacted a woman from the local women's shelter. She had approached me earlier in the year and given me her card. She told me when I was ready, she'd help me disappear, and that's just what she did. The only mistake I made was contacting my niece to let her know that it was okay. That must have been where Neil got my number. His way of luring me in was certainly imaginative. I'd completely forgotten how manipulative he could be if he wanted something. He used that to his advantage, and it came very close to working. Although he didn't appear yet to know my location, he was right. He would find me if I stayed where I was. So, as I had twice before, I quickly threw my possessions into my car and moved on. I'm currently living across the country, or maybe I'm not, from where I was at the time. A lot of people reading this might wonder why I'm going through all this trouble. All I have to do is get the police involved, right? I did try that course in the beginning, but he violated the orders and attacked me anyway. That way, almost cost me my entire life. Never again. Until he realizes it's not worth his time, I'm willing to continue bouncing from place to place, putting down no roots. Even if I die single and alone. Every moment I'm safe makes it worth it. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, do not hesitate to reach out for help. It may mean the difference between life and death. In high school, I took part in something I would live to regret. Although I never thought of myself as a mean girl, I see now that I wasn't far off. I had a small group of female friends, and we all thought we were the coolest of cool. We didn't fit in any group per se, but we were closest with the preppy people. More than one of us dated football players and became pretty popular by default. It was a very vapid and empty life in retrospect, but in my 16-year-old mind, I was among the elite of the school. On the other end of the spectrum was Dwight. He was everything you think of when you hear the term neckbeard. His bathing habits were almost non-existent, and his overblown sense of intelligence made him a lot of enemies. Most, if not all, the students I knew couldn't stand the guy. One day during algebra class, a few of us came up with a funny trick to play on him. It was cruel, but we believed that he deserved it because he annoyed us. God, was I a stupid girl. The plan was this. We would write anonymous love letters and drop them in Dwight's locker. If all worked out, he would believe that he had a secret admirer and make an idiot of himself. The end of the plan was something you'll have to wait a little longer to hear. That same day, my girls and I got together at lunch and wrote the first letter. We drew straws to decide who would deliver the letter, and I came up short. I waited until class started and slipped out to use the restroom. This was when I dropped it into his locker. Over the next few weeks, we'd continue with the letters. Soon enough, news reached us of Dwight's secret love. He had been bragging about her before school. He told us firsthand about how sexy she thought he was, and among other things. The urge to laugh in his face was almost unbearable, but none of us gave the game away until the time was right. That time came 2 weeks later. The lunchroom would be the place to spring our trap. Homecoming was coming up and we decided to use it to our advantage. His secret admirer was ready to show herself and she wanted him to ask her to the dance. Just to make things that much crueler, he was told to bring a rose with him when they met. When the day came, we told all our friends about our plan. They wanted to be there to witness the funny scene themselves. About 20 or so of us hid around a corner until he showed up. He arrived on schedule, rose in hand, but nobody was there to meet him. He began looking around nervously, and that's when we popped out and began laughing. The whole lunchroom was staring as we pointed and mocked him. His face turned bright red, and he looked as if though he was about to begin crying. He ran off at this point, so I can't say if he actually broke down or not. To this day, it's the thing I'm most ashamed of doing. After our horribly cruel joke was done, we went on to other things, all but forgetting about Dwight. I don't remember seeing him for a few days after that, not that I blame him if he wanted to lay low for a while. Homecoming came and went, and this was when the scary stuff began happening. My first experience was mild compared to some later things. Our house got toilet papered just before a big rainstorm. It took 2 weeks to get all the paper out of the trees and bushes. A similar thing happened to my friend, Stormy. She got lucky though. Without the rain, it wasn't hard to clean up. Things grew more serious from there. Another close friend of mine had her cheerleading yard sign burned in her front yard. All the windshield wipers on my car were ripped off and the windows were covered in shoe polish. Stormy's brand new birthday present, a beautiful red Mustang, was keyed up and down both sides. Similarly, I had all 4 of my tires slashed. We had nothing to give the police or to our parents, and the truth is, we made a lot of people mad and we couldn't prove it was anyone over the other. One final statement would cause us to break. One weeknight around 2 a.m., a loud crash came through my window. I leapt out of bed to see glass all over the floor. I couldn't see what had caused it until I turned on my overhead light. Stuck halfway under my bed was a brick with a letter attached to it. Before I could read it, my mother started banging on my door. I was unsure what it said, so I ripped it off the brick and stuck it in my pocket prior to letting my mom in. She did her usual overdramatic thing while I cleaned up the glass. Things quickly blew over and she went back to bed. I did a temporary patch on the window and crawled back into bed myself. Only then did I unfold the note. It was scrawled in black ink and read simply, "Say you're sorry." The next day at school, I showed it to the 2 other girls. We still weren't positive that Dwight was the one doing all this, but we were desperate. We were scared and just wanted it all to be over. We waited until we saw him at his locker and confronted him about the note. He was calm and unconcerned. He took a quick glance at us and said something to the effect of, "I don't know anything about it, but maybe you should start by apologizing to all the people you've screwed over. All the terrible stuff might stop." That was just what we had planned, and just what we did. One by one, each of us who had been attacked told all of our victims that we were sorry. I can't say every apology was heartfelt, but we did it. A few people told us to screw off, but we accepted it. A funny thing happened after doing all that. I began to feel better about myself, actually. I've been an insecure child my whole life. Slowly, I made the effort to be kinder to people and it paid off. By graduation, I'd befriended several of those I once openly mocked. It cost me a few of my old friends, but I didn't miss them much. Because of that one cruel joke, I'm a far better person than I was at 16. After all these years, one little question remains. Was it Dwight who did all those awful things to us? He was at our 10-year class reunion, and I considered asking him. In the end, I didn't want to dredge up all that past ill will, so I didn't. It was the most probable answer, but there are others just as possible. Maybe all our victims play their own part. A bit of murder on the Orient Express, if you will. I won't say I'm glad it happened in that way. I was terrified, and I don't believe in violence to get what you want. I will say one thing, though. I hope he's truly as happy now as he appeared when I last saw him. I wouldn't wish his style of revenge on anyone. You don't want him as an enemy. In the spring of 2017, I had a somewhat unnerving experience with a girl's father that leaves me remorseful to this day. The whole episode started a couple of months earlier. I was nearing 23 and my life was headed nowhere essentially. One cold evening after work, I discovered a note under the windshield wiper of my car. It was dark and I was tired, so I stuck it in my pocket and drove home. The next morning, I remembered it and took it out to read. It was from an unknown girl. She'd seen me in the store before and was interested in getting to know me. It didn't say how she knew which car was mine, but I didn't really care. The small details weren't important. After almost a 2-year dry spell, things were finally looking up, so I thought. Another week passed and a second note appeared. In a nutshell, my secret admirer wanted us to meet that coming Friday. If I was interested, I was to leave my answer in the same place as she had been leaving her letters. Naturally, I was very interested. My next shift, I stuck my answer under the driver's side wiper and prayed that she would pick it up. She did just that and left a time and location behind for me to meet her. This took place on a Wednesday, which meant that I only had one full day to prepare. I got up especially early the next day so I could get everything done before work. In addition to a nice short haircut, I also combed every man's clothing store I could find for the perfect outfit. I eventually got what I needed and headed to work. By the last hour of my shift on Friday, my guts were a churning mess. I had 2 hours between getting off of work and date time, which I spent on the toilet. Around 6:45, I took a quick shower and made my way to the spot. I entered and instantly made eye contact with this amazing girl. If this was her, I had hit pay dirt. The girl stood up and approached me. She introduced herself as Carissa and told me I looked very handsome. This had turned out to be the luckiest day of my life. We sat down at the table and looked at each other. The waitress walked up and took our drink orders. While we waited, we made small talk. Both of us were clearly nervous and stumbled over our words. I was so amazed at how beautiful she was. It was like God had made her just for me. The red of her hair was like fire and her blue eyes reminded me of jewels. The waitress returned and we ordered our meals. Things began to get more relaxed after that. I asked her the normal stuff like her background and family. I told her more about me and how I'd arrived at my present state. The usual stuff, I guess. I knew even before the date had ended that I wanted to see her again, and she happily agreed and we made plans for the next Saturday. As childish as it may sound, I was already falling in love. The week in between the first and second dates seemed like an eternity, but when the time did come, I was no less excited to see her than the night we met. The two of us would continue meeting for another month. There was no sense of urgency, yet it didn't seem logical to drag our feet either. She expressed the desire for me to meet her parents. A serious step in any relationship, and I was both excited and terrified in equal measures, but she assured me that her folks would love me. I went into the meeting with that in mind. Overall, things seemed to go well, although I did sense a bit of hesitance on the part of her father. I could tell that he was a very traditional type of man and attempted to portray himself in the same manner. I couldn't tell if he accepted me or not, so I had to rely on Carissa's assurances. I had no idea how bad things were about to get. In hindsight, I question if I should have been more honest about my past to avoid any unforeseen things creeping up on me unaware. Perhaps I wouldn't have been caught so unprepared when it did happen. It had only been 3 or 4 days since meeting with Carissa's parents when a terrifying thing occurred. I was driving home after working a double and I was exhausted. I had just exited the highway and was about a mile from home when the lights of a cop car lit up my rearview mirror. I pulled over into the nearest parking lot and removed my license and insurance from my wallet. The cop approached my driver's side window, and I was shocked to see that it was Carissa's dad. Somehow, in the tension of the meeting, I forgot to ask what he did for a living. He hadn't given me that cop vibe that night, but it now made sense. I was unsure why I had been pulled over. Maybe I had been swerving because I was tired. It was possible. I rolled down my window and said hi. He ignored me and asked for my paperwork. I gave it to him, and he walked back to his car. Something seemed off about the entire scenario. I knew for a fact that I wasn't speeding, nor did I have any malfunctioning parts in my car. When he returned, I asked him for an explanation. He ignored me and handed my papers back. His silence and aloof manner were starting to make me angry. We just stared at one another for about 10 seconds before he finally coughed up a reason. Not word for word, but he informed me that he had done a background check on me and discovered that I had an arrest for drug possession and DUI when I was 18. I admitted to it and explained that it was a stupid mistake and I'd learned my lesson. I hadn't drank any alcohol or touched another drug since then, not to mention had as much as a ticket in the intervening years. He wasn't listening. I was told explicitly that I was never to see his daughter again, and this made me furious. She was an adult, and he had no say in the matter, and I told him as much. And this was the wrong thing to do. He told me if I insisted on seeing her again that I would be harassed by him and his fellow officers to the point of planting drugs in my car or on my person. I felt the air had been knocked out of me. That was it. I tapped out. It had taken me this long just to be able to get a decent job. I wasn't willing to lose everything for a girl I hardly knew. If it had been a test of my determination, I'd failed. I indicated that I understood, and he sent me on my way. I wasn't going back to jail for anyone, and the thought of going back terrified me. I wasn't a tough guy. My first visit still haunted me 5 years later. I put off the phone call until the end of the following day. I considered just sending her a text, but thought it too cowardly. Around 9 p.m., I made the call. I tried small talk, but she could sense what I was doing and demanded I spit it out. I did it as fast as possible and hung up. I wanted to give her the real reason, but thought it may cause more problems down the line. She called back a few times that night, but I didn't answer. What was done was done. I never saw or spoke to her again. To my relief, her dad held his side of the bargain too. I don't harbor any ill will toward him. I suppose I may have done something similar if I had a daughter. I can't really say for sure. My life is going okay at present, but a day doesn't pass that I don't think of what could have happened. I hope she found someone who makes her happy, I guess. There's a lot I wish I could take back, but hurting that girl is the only thing that I truly regret. I won't lie, I got caught up in the romance of it. I'd been single too long and my barriers were down. He said all the right things and the roses didn't hurt his case. I fell in love with the idea of a mysterious and handsome stranger wanting me and only me. Had everything stopped there, I would have been disappointed, but at least I'd be left with the beautiful fantasy. They did not, and I allowed myself to hope that we could be together one day. Until then, I'd write to him about the other plans I had for myself after the restrictions were lifted. He was tolerant of this initially, but soon, his letters became more and more demanding. Who I could see or where I could go, and despite my reservations, I agreed to his rules. He was just looking out for my best interests, I guess. And after all, it was just make-believe anyway, right? Our correspondences continued, and when talk of restrictions being lifted came to light, I was contacted by my former boss and asked to return. I happily accepted and wrote to my admirer to share the good news. To my surprise, he was anything but pleased. According to him, I was violating our agreement. I was confused and wondered how he expected me to survive. All the benefits I had been receiving would soon end. I had no other choice but wait tables again. My reasoning, no matter how logical it was, fell on deaf ears. I got only curses and foul names in return. This was a crossroads in our relationship, and for me, there was only one clear way to go. As the opening of public spaces got closer, I chose to end things. It had been wonderful, but it was time to drop the fantasy. No matter how awful this made me feel, it was the right thing to do. I was not a kept woman, nor would I be if it was possible. No man, regardless of how much I loved him, was going to make that sort of ridiculous demand on me. Agreeing to a few superficial things while we were trapped inside of our homes was one thing, but what he wanted was just ridiculous. I wrote all this in a letter as nicely as I could and sent it out. It didn't take long to receive his reply. I hadn't expected him to be happy, but what he wrote shocked me to my core. Things had now moved way past petty name-calling and curses. He was threatening me, but not just me, my family also. He included actual information about my parents that terrified me. Their addresses, phone numbers, jobs, everything. If he thought this would change my mind, he was very wrong. All he'd managed to do was make me mad. With all the letters in hand, I filed a report with the police. Had I had an actual name, I would have filed a restraining order. Going through this process really drove home to me how ridiculous the entire situation was. Falling in love with an anonymous man was the height of stupidity. For all I know, it wasn't even a man. You never know in a mess like this. What little I could do was done. I notified my friend of my actions in a letter, but have yet to get a reply. It's been more than 2 months, and I hope this means that he's moved on. I chose not to let my parents in on the threats. I didn't want to scare them if there was no immediate danger, but probably embarrassment was a stronger motivation. My mom would never let me live it down, that's for sure. And unless there is a change in the coming weeks or months, it looks as if though he's been scared off. I don't think I'll post any future updates, no matter what happens. I'd rather just put it all behind me and try to reclaim the normal life I've been deprived of the last 2 years. Despite wanting to use my mistakes as a warning to other girls, if I thought anyone could identify me, I wouldn't have written this. But I have. So if any girl reading this finds herself in a situation similar to mine, throw the letter away and forget about it. This is real life, not a movie. No handsome prince is going to kiss you at the end of the story. In real life, you always end up with the frog. Let me start off this story by saying it is a very long one that unfortunately doesn't have a concrete end as of yet. I do wish to remain entirely anonymous, so I will not be using any real names just in case. I'm currently a 29-year-old female. I'll be calling myself Kai. At the time of the beginning of this tale, I was 19. Now, a little backstory, I was pretty much a loner in high school. I had only really one friend that we'll call Alex that I hung out with. During my 8th grade year, Alex and I dated a bit over the summer. Unfortunately, things did not end up going well, another story for another time, but he unnerved me with some of his behavior. It was in my 9th grade year that I met the boy that I would later marry, and we'll call him Colby, and this is where our story has its true beginning. It was 2009. I had recently graduated high school in my local hometown after moving back from Montana. Colby and I had been dating at this time for around 2 years, and we were very close. My last year of high school, I spent most of my time hanging out with him and his friends, a group of wild, misfit young men. I loved them all. For the first time in my school life, I felt accepted, wanted. They had their faults, yes, but anything weird they did was nothing compared to what was going to walk into our lives next. I'm a year and a half older than Colby, so after I graduated, he still had 1 more year to go. It was in that year that he met who we'll call Jake. He met him in a vocational class that he took as an optional course, and sometimes I wish he had never stepped foot in that classroom. It all started when Colby had befriended Jake enough to give him my phone number. Colby explained that the boy had been homeschooled and was terribly lonely. He seemed to have the same interests as Colby and I, so I didn't terribly mind. At first, I felt sorry for him. He did actually call me the same night that Colby gave him my number, reason being I was working on a project that required voice acting, which he was extremely into. We talked for a bit, and he seemed like an okay guy. As the weeks progressed, Colby was delighted that we were all getting along so well. Unfortunately, that didn't last long. One night, after we had maybe a handful of phone conversations, I was about to hang up with Jake and call Colby when he says to me, "Wow, you're so easy to talk to. I've never felt like this before. It's like I've known you my whole life." Taken aback, I merely agreed before quickly hanging up. I shrugged off the offhanded comment and tried to forget, but that was a big mistake. The following weeks were a torrent of daily calls. Jake began calling every single day. At first, it was kind of nice to have someone to talk to during the day. I still live with my parents, but they were busy wrapping things up with selling the house back in Montana, and my older brother worked odd hours. Jake then began exhibiting some behavior that truly began to throw me off. Like I said, he would call daily. He would expect me to talk to him for hours, too. If I hung up, he'd just call right back. And I know what you're thinking. Just don't answer. Well, I wanted to do that after a while, but I didn't want my parents finding out what was going on. I did try mentioning all this to Colby, but he managed to convince me that I was just being paranoid. I know now that I wasn't. At July, Colby and I's good friend, and we'll call him Mike, was having his birthday party. He also knew Jake from the same class that he'd shared with Colby, so he was also invited to the party. This was my first time meeting Jake in person. I was already wary of this guy, but I won't ever forget the way that he looked at me the first time he saw me, like a lion looks at an antelope. He politely introduced himself and shook my hand, making me internally shudder. Not once did he even seem to blink while looking at me. Colby could tell that I was a little uncomfortable, so he led the way into the living room and we sat down on the love seat. Jake entered and sat down on the couch, with Mike standing behind him. After a few moments, Jake patted the seat next to him while looking at me. "You know, you could sit over here. I don't bite." Yes, he really did this right in front of Colby. You have to understand, Colby is a nice guy to a fault. He honestly had felt so sorry for this kid that he continued to give him the benefit of the doubt. Why would Kai sit over there? I'm over here and I'm her boyfriend." I remained quiet, merely nodding while cuddling into Colby's side. Jake pouted, but the rest of the party went on fairly normal. When it came time for me to leave, however, Jake became overwhelmingly upset that I didn't give him a hug. I ignored this and went home. For all intents and purposes, the story should have ended there. Should have, but didn't. Jake is a master at making others feel sorry for him. A few weeks later and throughout the summer, he continued calling me daily. It got to the point of angering Colby when he would call me and wouldn't be able to get through. I had made up my mind that I had had enough of this and was not going to play nice anymore. If he annoyed me, I was going to tell him. One evening, Jake called me. Groaning when I saw the caller ID, I picked up the phone. Jake's cheerful voice greeted me, and we chatted for a while before he said possibly the most disturbing thing he'd said yet. "It's not like you cheat on Colby with me." Annoyed at this point with his antics, I shot back, "No, I love Colby, and Colby would kill you." This seemed to put an end to things for a while. That fall, we all got a job working at a haunted attraction nearby on a farm. We were all overjoyed to get to work together. Jake unfortunately put a stop to that too. The hours were from around 6 to 12 or 1 a.m. We usually timed it where we would arrive at around 4 or 5 so we would have time to put all our costume makeup on for the attraction and relax a bit prior to work. Well, one day when we arrived, I had to use the bathroom very badly. Thinking nothing of it, as we were on a farm, I informed Colby that I would be walking down the little hill for a bit, my code for bathroom. Colby nodded in understanding and agreed to stand guard, and I walked down the little slope and set about to do my business, when I heard Jake calling for me. I heard Colby telling him that I'm going to the bathroom and not to go around back of the barn. And yes, you guessed it. Here I am with my pants down, and here comes Jake around the corner of the barn. You know, exactly where Colby told him not to come. Colby runs him off, but not before he manages to steal a quick peek. I still shudder to this day recalling that. Jake had done a lot of other creepy things over the years since then, such as staring directly at me while Colby and I kissed one time. Other things I simply cannot say here as they're too explicit. We do still have contact with him, and I still occasionally see him. So Jake, if you're reading this and can work out that it's you I am talking about, please take a hint. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, it's Morbin time.